great pleasure to welcome you to this panel session on Pacific Solutions for the Climate Crisis. So I'm an Associate Professor of Law at the School of Law at Waipapa Taumata Rau, the University of Auckland. I'd like to acknowledge Ngāti Whātua, which is mana whenua over this land in Tamaki Makaurau. Ngā mihi to the many distinguished guests and participants in this conference, some from over the Moana, some from other parts of the Motu, and to those who are joining us online. Nau mai, haere mai. I'd like to pass on our special thanks to Konrad Adenauer Stiftung for its generous support for this conference and also for sponsoring this panel discussion. Tina Queer, Eva Wagner, the Foundation's Senior Program Coordinator for its Australia and Pacific Regional Program, who's travelled from Canberra to be with us today. So as mentioned, the topic for this panel session is Pacific Solutions for the Climate Crisis. And before I introduce the panelists, I just want to make a couple of scene-setting points about the title and about the topic for the session. The first point is that the phrase in the title is climate crisis, not Pacific climate crisis. And that's appropriate because, as newspapers and scientific journals remind us on a daily basis, the impacts of the climate crisis are being experienced all over the globe. And New Zealand, of course, has had visceral experiences of that earlier this year, including in February's Cyclone Gabrielle, when, as Prime Minister Rambuka reminded us this morning, 34 Fijian personnel making up the Fijian Humanitarian Assistance to the Disaster Relief Task Force travelled to the Hawke's Bay to assist with the clean-up and recovery process. Still, though, and recognising that Pacific countries are by no means uniform and have centuries of experience with climatic and environmental challenges, the IPCC has identified particular climate change impacts that have particular relevance for Pacific nations, and mention has been made of some of these already today and will be well known to this audience. And they include exposure to the effects of sea level rise, extreme sea level events, including coastal storm surges, coastal flooding on small islands. And the 2022 IPCC Working Group 2 report, which has synthesised the latest scientific research forecasts in the Pacific, some of the largest increases in endemic extinctions, in impairments to ecosystems, and reduced habitability of small islands. The second point concerns the phrase Pacific Solutions in the panel session title. And again, I think this choice of words is very deliberate. It's not New Zealand or Australia's solutions for the Pacific, although, as we'll hear, these countries might be able to assist. The title recognises that Pacific states have long been the architects of national, of regional, and indeed international solutions to the climate crisis. And I think the history of Pacific responses to climate change as involving as much or more about states and international bodies following Pacific leads as the idea of imposing solutions from the outside. So the first formal reference to loss and damage in the international climate change negotiations came in a submission made by Vanuatu on behalf of AOSIS to the panel which was drafting the UN Climate Convention way back in 1991. It was on the initiative largely of Pacific Islands Advocacy that saw the 1.5 degree target included in the Paris Agreement. And as has already been mentioned today, the UN General Assembly request to the International Court of Justice for an advisory opinion on climate change is the direct output of an initiative spearheaded by young Pacific Island students with the support of the government of Vanuatu and New Zealand. Let me now introduce to you the panellists, and we're fortunate to have three experts from quite different fields who will share their insights on the topic from distinct but I think complementary angles. The first is the Member of Parliament for the Green Party of Aotearoa, New Zealand, Golriz Ghahraman. Golriz is joining us online from her office in Parliament in Pōneke, Wellington. Over the course of a rich career, she has worn many hats: undergraduate student at Auckland, postgraduate student at Oxford, UN lawyer in Rwanda, Cambodia, The Hague, a barrister, and from 2017, New Zealand's first MP from a refugee background. But I think the most relevant to today's session is the Green Party spokesperson for Foreign Affairs and a current member of Parliament's Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade Select Committee. Tēnā koe, Golriz. Our second panellist is Peter Rudd, Executive Director for the International Development, Aotearoa, New Zealand, a position that he took up after a distinguished career of over 25 years in New Zealand and internationally in private, non-governmental and public sector organisations, including government entities. The final panellist is Schannel Van Dijken, who has the kind of remarkable CV that leaves you reaching for the smelling salts. His LinkedIn bio will trigger widespread senses of inadequacy, so perhaps it's best that you avoid it. It describes him as marine biologist, explorer, Polynesian voyager, educator, practitioner. With Samoan and Dutch heritage, Schannel was raised in New Zealand but has worked all over the world, including significant stints in the Pacific. And of the many things that he's done since 2018, he has spearheaded the co-development of Samoa's Voyaging canoe-based environmental education program, or floating classroom, which is now being rolled out into Samoan primary school curriculum. So the format of this session will be similar to others. Each speaker will speak for about 10 minutes. We'll move then into a Q&A. Please hold your questions for the session after the speakers have presented. I'll be back to chair that at the end. Over to you, Golriz. Thank you.
Kia ora koutou. Sorry I can't be with you. Parliament is sitting, but today we had an estimates hearing with the Minister for Defence that was very on point to this discussion, and I'll bring some of those questions and answers to this topic. I've been a member of the Select Committee, which is formally the Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade Committee, and I think it's interesting that those topics are seen as being intrinsically linked in our oversight bodies in Parliament for 2 terms now. And I think that there has been a shift between the 2 terms, so I wanted to focus on the shift in both New Zealand's approach to climate crisis in the Pacific and our role in that context between the 2 terms, and to kind of place them in terms of the things that seem to me to be influencing that shift. So last term we began with a big acknowledgement of climate crisis as the existential crisis most relevant to our Pacific neighbourhood. We, I think, culturally in terms of foreign affairs, started to much more overtly identify as a Pacific nation, which we are. And so we had the Pacific reset in terms of humanitarian aid models, and I initiated an inquiry that all members of the committee supported into what that model would look like. And so we did that. We had, towards sort of the end and early into this term, the 1.3 billion into climate finance, which we give to global entities, but with a Pacific focus and implications for the Pacific. And we also had last term, for the first time, recognition by the Minister for Defence that climate crisis is now the leading focus, and I think it has been for years, but overtly recognised as the leading issue in policy setting for our Defence Force, who very much are present in the Pacific and monitor 1/5 of the world's oceans, and so could speak very directly to the experience of what that crisis looks like. You know, literally on their vessels, they can see the erosion from sea rises. So it was nice to have them involved. All of that was culturally important to the entities that kind of govern the way that New Zealand interacts with our Pacific neighbours, but also in recognising that actually the climate crisis is a global issue and it's a Pacific issue, not just one that we deal with in terms of emission standard setting, for example, for ourselves, and although that's important, obviously, as well. But, you know, whether or not those policy shifts and sort of culture shifts that were signalled have had an impact in terms of the way that we in fact behave, I think need to be examined more closely. And in terms of the Humanitarian Aid Inquiry, we did find, because we heard from everyone and we heard from people in the Pacific and we heard from NGOs here and we heard from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs over and over again, that whilst we are a better nation in terms of partnership in aid delivery, and we're good at identifying the voices of the Pacific that tell us what their issues are and what their solutions are, we're not necessarily that good at focusing long term in terms of, for example, retaining our foreign affairs presence in a project that would go on and on with the same personnel. People would come and go. So attrition rates in the Pacific by us were seen as a problem. Things like that were operational were things that we could report back on. But one of the things that really stood out for me that we don't necessarily recognise when we talk about aid is the scale of the inequality issue that we're trying to address when we talk about Pacific aid and climate crisis. And what kept coming through is that Pacific debt is in fact the underlying issue that we are not necessarily recognising and we're not necessarily helping with, given that we don't own a lot of Pacific debt, but we have access to international forums like the WTO, the IMF, our relationship with other trading partners, the EU, the US and China. So that came through and that was last term. And since then, we've had the COVID crisis and we've had a highly internationalized war in Ukraine that have created two major issues that I think have begun to really undermine the way that both our Defence Force focus and our foreign affairs and aid focus in terms of the climate crisis is impacted in the Pacific. So Pacific debt is something that remains, and most of that has been accrued as a result of things like climate crisis events like tsunamis, and that's certainly something that nations like Tonga are still grappling with. That debt is largely owed to China, for example, in the case of Tonga. But the COVID crisis froze Pacific economies. So for us to be focused on climate mitigation projects, for example, or support in terms of environmental protections, we're doing another inquiry into illegal and overfishing, for example, through this committee. It becomes really out of touch when you go and talk with Pacific Island nations who are trying desperately to retain their people who they're losing to our fruit picking industries over here because they can't pay anyone. They can't retain professionals who can work in those fields. They can't possibly prioritise the projects that we want to prioritise when they're dealing with very base level economic insecurity, the likes of which they haven't seen before. They are servicing only debt with their economies. And on top of that, the security issue that's arisen, where we see our old world allegiances as being far more prominent now in our minds in terms of global affairs, and they remain in many ways reliant on China and Chinese debt, has sort of manifested in a way that's again out of touch. So we're coming in with these military allegiances with the US and announcing them. AUKUS is happening, and all of that means that Pacific Island voices are again made secondary. So we have trade, foreign affairs and defence sitting in one committee, a committee that's meant to be highlighting our relationships with the Pacific as being our primary, feel-good culture in over the last two terms. And then we have New Zealand engaging with the rest of those issues as if we are a Five Eyes Western nation that is really, really stoked that the US wants to enter into another and we announced it without talking to the Pacific Islands Forum, fairly opaque military cooperation agreement in the Pacific. So I don't think that we're always behaving in a way that's mana enhancing in terms of lifting the voices of the Pacific, even as we've initiated these resets to focus on climate crisis. I think they've become secondary, and I think we do need to look at how much we in fact know the solutions to climate crisis without referring back to the Pacific, because they have been experiencing this for far longer than we have. And without going on for too much longer, in terms of the overfishing inquiry, our committee, and the biodiversity crisis is really, really significant, and this is really relevant to the climate crisis. We travelled, some of us, to Fiji, some of us to Tonga, some of us to the Solomon Islands. I was able to go to Fiji and Tonga. In Fiji at the Pacific Islands Forum, this undermining of the Pacific Islands Forum voice was raised with us directly when we spoke about the Solomon Islands security agreement with China, even though we were there to talk about fishing and climate crisis issues. Why is New Zealand prioritising the interests of the US without talking to the Pacific? In Tonga, the Speaker of the House of Representatives, when he addressed us in his very first welcoming address, he said, and we had just travelled there as rains were falling in Auckland for a second time and causing a state of emergency, he said, now you are experiencing the climate crisis as we have been for decades. But remember that while your trading relationships are being prioritised so that you continue to subsidise fossil fuels in your trading forums, you're paying for your own next flood to happen, and you're paying for the next tsunami that we will have. And that was a real message for us, to know that we can't actually solve this through climate finance or through humanitarian aid or through low-level relationship building without also prioritising the interests of the Pacific, the voices and solutions of the Pacific on climate crisis whenever we go to the negotiating table on a free trade agreement, whenever we consider a military allegiance with one of our old-time partners, and certainly whenever we buy a vessel in our defence procurements. We keep buying these expensive vessels that have war-making technology to make the US and Australia happy. Are they really fit for purpose in a world where fuel is not only far more expensive sometimes or hard to get to, but also we live in the South Pacific, where our emissions and our carbon footprint should be the priority, and we're using those vessels pretty much only to deliver environmental protection and disaster relief to the Pacific. So maybe that's a negative perspective, but I think that's my perspective as having sat for 2 terms through the hopeful burst of recognition of our priority to partnership with the Pacific on climate crisis in particular, to a very quick, to my mind, unravelling of that as we prioritise free trade agreements and security allegiances, and overlooked the true impact of the financial crisis of COVID in the Pacific that can't be solved with aid, but will need us to actually rethink economic models that our partners are committed to. I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much, Golriz. It was fantastic to get your insight, and you've brought some different perspectives to others that we've heard from today. So if you don't mind just hanging around for the question and answer, there may well be some questions for you a little bit later on. So without further ado, I'll invite Peter Rudd to present. Thank you, Peter.
That's the one. Thanks so much. Kia ora, koutou and Nisa Bulavanaka. I used to work for the Fiji Trade Commission here, my good colleague Camilla in the audience. I thought having the Fijian PM here today, it's nice to have him in the audience and to honour that as well. And thank you, Vernon, for the introduction. I appreciate it, and NZIIA and obviously Conrad Aotearoa, I think, who are sponsoring this session. Thank you so much. So I'm Peter, I'm with the Council for International Development. We've been given a fairly ambitious subject matter here. As you can see, it's a broad and a deep topic. Might get a show of hands. Has anyone seen a photo like this on the internet recently? Yeah, so there's this was actually taken December 21, and I thought I'd lead in with this just to sort of say the Pacific has got quite crowded recently, if you've noticed. It's fairly busy, and the wider Indo-Pacific is no exception to that. This was taken December 21. Obviously, there's been even more recent episodes in the last couple of weeks. It's a Chinese J-11 fighter jet. Basically, I don't know how many metres, maybe 20 metres off the wing there of a US Air Force aircraft flying over international airspace in the South China Sea. Do many of you recognise this photo? I'd probably like to say that this photo has been even more recognised, and it sort of speaks to the reality in the Pacific and what they're really dealing with. The number one issue, which they keep telling us, and I think maybe sometimes the world forgets, is actually climate change. Geopolitics play a part, but climate change is an immediate threat to their way of life. This is a Tuvalu foreign minister presenting, I think it was at the COP26, with the statement, "We are sinking." Pretty profound and pretty powerful. And there's one thing I can say, I think Pacific leaders are actually leading on advocacy around climate change, which I'll get into a little bit further. So who we are, you may or may not know us. We're the peak body for the international development sector. So we've got about 90 plus members and we're growing. So World Vision, Fred Hollows, Save the Children, UNICEF, not sure if Teresa is still here, but Island Partnerships, my colleague Kate is here, down the front here. So we have full members and affiliated members. Some of our affiliate members include the likes of Fisher & Paykel Healthcare and engineering firm Tonkin & Taylor that are doing pre-warning tsunami systems in the Pacific. We connect, strengthen and advocate for the INGO sector in New Zealand and globally. We connect with multilaterals, governments and other development actors around the world. And we have a long-term partnership with our friends at New Zealand Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade. So I thought we've had a lot of words today, so excuse the diagrams, but I thought maybe a picture tells 1,000 words. I particularly like this one, the Venn diagram. It's simple, but it's effective, and it's sort of recognising that we're all in this together. And SID and our members are operating in that sweet spot in the middle there, which is effective development. And for us to really make impact and make a difference globally as a small South Pacific nation ourselves, we need to be doing this and doing better. When we're doing better, those Venn diagrams will grow and that sweet spot in the middle should grow. So you've got civil society, government, and the private sector. The OECD DAC, I'm not sure if many of you are familiar with that, recently did an audit or review of MFAT, the most recent one since, I believe, 2015. And there's some fairly strong assessment in there about where MFAT could potentially be improving. And part of the what I wanted to recognise is our ODA is still quite limited and we're not really on target. So our official development assistance, we have mandated by the UN and signed up to working towards a 0.7% ODA against gross national income, or GNI. And we're tracking last year at about 20.23%. We're well off. And our OECD peers are doing better. In fact, New Zealand ranks 22nd against 29 other members of OECD in terms of our development aid. So we need to be doing better, and we need to be doing more development aid and doing it better. So within our members, we do an annual survey of the international development sector here in Aotearoa, and last year our members' total development spend was about $236 million, which was an increase. And people are often surprised your members are funded through government. Well, they are to some extent, but MFAT, or government contribution, is actually quite low. It's about 17%. Where our members and NGOs are funded is actually through you guys. It's mums and dads, youth, people that actually want to make a difference and want to see whether that's funding into a child or youth program or a gender program, or into something my colleague Schannel will talk about, conservation and the great work they're doing there. So the New Zealand public is very generous, but again, it's a challenging space, and with cost of living crisis, that is going to be impacted as well. We also survey the top 10 countries for international development spend, and you're probably not surprised to see that the Pacific features fairly heavily. In fact, Fiji is number 1 as of last year. Papua New Guinea is number 3, and the Solomons is coming in at, I think it's number 8. So sometimes we do need to remind people, though, that our members operate in 190 different countries. So we're in Myanmar, we're in Ukraine, we're in Turkey and Syria, presents a whole lot of complications getting into Syria for humanitarian aid, as you can imagine, and obviously in Africa. And we've heard a lot about Ukraine, which is absolutely important, and we should be, but the Ukraine crisis is actually impacting on other nations even more significantly, particularly in food security in Africa. We also measure against SDGs, and our members are operating across all 17 of the Sustainable Development Goals. Number 13, 27 of our members are doing deliberate action work around climate change. So I mentioned MFAT, and MFAT are a great partner for us and for our members, as are other donors in the region. And it's great to see that climate finance is stepping up. It's probably not too soon, I'd say, and MFAT are really mobilising and moving into the space, and there will be funding for some of our members through that. So I'm hoping to see some really exciting and innovative programs coming out of our membership in the next couple of years. I won't go into the detail, and probably some MFAT colleagues are here in the audience, so you can speak to them about the details, but there's some pretty exciting funding going into that space for our members. So you're probably asking, what do our NGOs do? Well, they do a range of things. So from climate resilience and adaptation, renewable energy, sustainable agriculture, coastal marine protection, climate advocacy and policy engagement, community empowerment, and obviously humanitarian aid. And there's a deep sort of array of different work programs that our members are working on in those areas. And I think Vernon touched on this earlier, and coming back to my earlier slide, the Pacific in a lot of ways are actually leading on advocacy, and advocacy is a massive area, and because advocacy, it affects policy level, it's out to civil society and members of the public, and it's at all levels up to senior government officials. So the Pacific in Vanuatu in particular have been pushing hard on climate change in an array of different areas. I've just presented a couple here. This is the announcement of the Loss and Damage Fund from COP27. And here at the UN General Assembly, that Vanuatu-led resolution calling for the advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice on Climate Change and Human Rights. So it's pretty amazing that these small Pacific states can actually lead on this stuff and often do a better job than Western societies. Finally, just a shameful plug, our annual conference is coming up in September down in Wellington, and we'll be exploring these issues further on the 20th and 21st, and we'd love to see you there. Thank you.
Thanks, Peter. Having had Golriz's kind of perspective from government, it was great to hear from the NGO sector, and so you might have some questions for Peter. Hold them for the next part. But at this point, I'd like to invite Schannel to come and talk to us. Thank you.
Bula, kia ora, kia rana, Māori, tolofalava. So I am going to be talking about Pacific and some of our solutions. And when doing that, we have to do it in a bit of a Pacific style. So I realise that there's been a lot of talking and talking at you. And how we do it in the Pacific is that we talk with you and we engage. So just to get you energized, and probably energized for myself too, I'm going to ask you all to stand up, and I'm going to teach you a few things quickly. It's called Experiential Education, hands-on education. This is how we learnt in the islands. All right, we're going to be rubbing our hands, right? That's mili, 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 rub, mili, mili, rub, 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 and then we're going to clap. That's pati, mili, 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 pati. And then I'm going to go lua pati, which is 2 clap, mili, 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 lua pati. All right, mili, mili, mili. Now I'm going to go 3 clap, which is tolu pati, right? Mili, 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 tolu pati. All right, keep it rubbing, mili, 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 mili. Now I'm going to go pati, 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 pati. Thank you. I hope that got you a little bit energized there. I still haven't sorted out technology. It's going a bit slow. I put this slide up here because I want you to see what we're talking about. This is our lone blue planet in the middle of the space, and as you'll notice, wow, as you'll notice, it's blue. And what you saw there was our Pacific. The ancestral grounds of my ancestors, of some of our ancestors that are sitting right here, that were called home for thousands and thousands of years. I am just, like I said, the technology was going to do something on me. The planet's back. Can you hear me when I'm talking from here? That photo was taken from Atlantis in 1990. That spaceship, as we strive to explore. And this is exactly what our ancestors did back in the day, using our own spaceships that we built and how we colonized and settled these tiny specks of islands on that big blue marble that you saw before. My ancestors, the greatest explorers this planet has ever seen, able to settle these tiny specks of islands. Thousands of years, they did this successfully. And they did this through nature. They were able to do that by understanding nature, by their relationship with nature, using nature to navigate, but also to be stewards. They used stars, sun, moon, biodiversity, whale sign. And they passed this on. And that ethos, that stewardship ethos, that navigation knowledge that some of you guys may know, if you've watched Moana, you know what I'm talking about, through hands-on experiential learning, song, dance, chant, storytelling, tattoo. Knowledge was made sticky. Then things changed. My other ancestors came into the region and bringing with it positives, but also negatives. Lines drawn up on maps. And closer to time, our climate started changing. Fisheries changing, temperatures changing, coral reefs changing. And our approaches to education changed. So rather than being environmentally based and being outside, we're learning inside classrooms, which is not hardwired into us. So this is a key point when we start talking about solutions, because we've got 50% of our demographic in the Pacific is under 23. In some countries, it's under 18. Now you think about that demographic coming through. So we have these problems: lost cultural knowledge, natural capital under threat, and an outdated education system that's based on colonial systems. And when we start thinking about solutions in the Pacific, there's not one island that you talk to that doesn't consider these four aspects when we talk about solutions. And that's ensuring that you start thinking about your past. Like what the Honourable Minister Mahuta just said at the opening, a cultural weapon. It's not a cultural weapon, it is using our cultural past to inform our knowledge. It's about looking around us now, looking what the threats are, who's there, what the bright spots are, merging what we have, and looking above and being guided by our faith, our mana, our spirituality. These are all important aspects. And only then can we really start looking at the future and what that entails, planning that. Enablement, not aid. As Prime Minister Rambuka went on, teach to fish, do not give the fish. So that's just some context about where we're at and what some of our solutions are. I'm going to give you a quick video as well, just to show you one of the solutions that we started building, using our Voyaging canoe as a floating classroom, working with the Samoa Ministry of Education, Sports and Culture, and give you a flavour of what our solutions entail. There's volume. It worked before. Perhaps as they just get that going with that video, I'll just move on so we're moving on with this. That video you can look up online. It's called The Guardians in Samoa. If you Google that, it'll come up with some of that programming in which we are using the Voyaging canoe as a floating classroom to visit all our different schools, working closely with the Ministry of Education and various other partners, and institutionalising some of this knowledge that I was talking to you about before, and the way that we approach education. How we do education, not the what of education. Some of our successes so far is that we've reached over 25 schools, over 1,000 students have been impacted. We're getting evidence of social diffusion through the families, and we're getting long-term retention. I can't tell you how amazing it is for me as a marine biologist being in our communities, come back a couple of weeks later and the kids are still going on about zooxanthellae. That's amazing. I think the video is just coming up and I would like to play that. So I'll let you run it if you want.
these voyaging canoes were the crafts that our ancestors sailed on. These are just symbols now, and of course the significance at this point in time, the Ngawalofa now represents a living culture for us. We're using it to take this very important message, not only within our islands, but throughout the world, about how important it is for us to take care of our oceans.
I do have a lot of traditional knowledge that I want to share with the young people of our youth. We want to bring to the people of the villages an awareness before it's too late.
The Guardians engages communities by sailing the Ngāofa, our voyaging canoe, into targeted district and communities where we spend a week embedded with their local schools and community there. We teach 5 different main themes, all through the lens of mitigating climate change and helping our communities be more climate resilient. In that week, the 5 themes that we address: Polynesian voyaging history, coral reef and coastal habitat health, fish communities and fisheries, terrestrial-based guardianship, and waste management. These are taught through 7 3-hour activity-based learning modules, which the students participate through a rotating system through the week.
You can learn about many different things. You can learn how to build boats, learn about how to protect marine life.
We're using Ngāofa as a platform to do marine science and connect our students with nature. All teaching modules incorporate the message of building pride on our voyaging history, unique environment, stewardship, and the importance of these in mitigating climate change impacts and threats. They're designed to be sticky, so that all have interactive activities, songs, dance, that become stuck in the participants' head, locking in and spreading that message. This is not a passive outreach project. It's an immersive program based on experiential and interactive learning, where elders are also engaged on the sidelines to share their stories.
I think the students are the future of Samoa, of our country. And I know after this program, each day, they went home and told everything they learned here to their parents and to their siblings.
When I go home, I'll teach my parents to don't cut trees next to the sea, don't burn trees, and plant 3 to 5 trees or more after you cut 1 tree off.
When I go home, I can probably teach my parents to help protect the marine life by not polluting the sea, help pick up the rubbish in the sea, and encourage others to stop polluting it.
The program is also built around building the capacity of our youth and voyaging society crew in being educators, ambassadors, champions for holistic guardianship.
Well, as a Samoan person, we're really proud of our culture, and voyaging here in Samoa is not a big thing anymore, and being a part of it and delivering a message about our ocean and our reefs is what we need.
We're teaching culture, we're teaching navigation, we're teaching environment, we're teaching knowing how to respect people.
For us to be able to travel around Samoa and Ngāofa and using that as a platform to deliver this very powerful message is powerful, is connected. This connects with people. This opens up hearts and then therefore opens up minds.
That's where our solutions lie, in our culture, in how we were educated, and concentrating on the how with the what. This is currently where we're working now with several Pacific Island countries to co-develop similar programming, working closely with their education ministries so we actually start institutionalising this. This is where real change comes from. Thank you very much. I just want to thank some of the partners that were up here and the partners that enabled me to be here, but I really appreciate your patience also with this, and thank you, Tech, for doing that. But whaftai te ali lava.
Kia ora, Schannel. For a lawyer and a law lecturer who's often lost in the text of international instruments of court decisions, it was just wonderful to be kind of reminded of the importance of some of these experiential learning elements and the role that that plays in contributing to solutions to the climate crisis, and you did that so powerfully. So kia ora for that, and also for kind of involving us in an experiential learning exercise, which we really, really appreciated. So we've got about 20 minutes left, and what I would like now to do is to hand it over to you to ask some questions of our panelists. We've got 3 fantastic panelists from quite different perspectives, as I said. So what I'd like to do is maybe take groups of 3 questions, and if you could raise your hand, it'd be fantastic if you could just briefly introduce yourself, and then let us know what the question is. It might be one targeted to a specific panelist, or it might be to the entire panel. Please keep your questions tight, and we'll get through more of them. So over to you.
Yeah, sweet, cool. Kia ora, thanks for all the insight. It's really awesome to see that we're developing a Pacific solution to the climate crisis, because it affects all of us. I'm Tom, I'm working on cyclone recovery, so this is quite poignant for my line of work. There's been a lot of terms about managed retreat in my line of work, and it's an unfortunate reality facing many Pacific nations. What's the Pacific solution for that? Does New Zealand have to look at different migration pathways, or even understand us, maybe relook at what it means to be, a Pacific nation? Just your commentary from any of the panelists would be great on that.
Fantastic. Great question on managed retreat. I wonder if we could get Golriz up on the screen so that she can be part of this. Do we have another question? Thank you.
Do you want us up there as well?
Oh, yeah, please do.
Are we on?
Please.
Yeah, cool.
Come on.
Kia ora, I probably should stand up. Kia ora, my name is Ellie. I'm a master's student at Vic studying international relations. And my question is more for Golriz, but I guess it's open to the other panelists as well. Do you think that our current institutions, both domestic and multilateral, are well equipped enough to deliver solutions in a time-sensitive manner? Climate change is existential and threatening Pacific Islands right now, and I think New Zealand has a part to play in it. Do you think our Parliament, for example, is fit to deal with it quick enough, or do you think, and a lot of discussion's been talked about today about devolution, or do you think devolving power from central government to NGOs or to iwi groups or Pacific Island groups specifically would be a better way forward to deal with it now rather than in 35, 40 years when they're all underwater? Thank you.
Fantastic. One more for this group. Thank you.
Kia ora, my name's Ryan. I'm also a student, but at Massey University doing a Master of Arts in Social Policy. My question is kind of in relation to the image that we saw of the Minister of Foreign Affairs from Tuvalu standing in the ocean, and the idea that some of these Pacific nations are under such threat that there's a possibility they may not exist in the future. And I'm curious to hear what the panelists' perspectives are on the responsibilities of New Zealand and other nations to deal with the fallout of that because there's been some conversations around what do we do when somebody does not have land or does not have a citizenship to a country because it does not exist anymore.
Yeah.
Does New Zealand have responsibility there? Do other Pacific nations have responsibility there? And how do we kind of deal with that in the future?
Brilliant. Thanks so much. So we've got 3 questions, as I recall. The first one on managed retreat. The second one, are New Zealand's constitutional systems, I guess, fit for purpose? And that third one on the existential threat to some Pacific nations and what New Zealand's responsibility might be in relation to people who may not be able to continue living on their islands. So over to the panellists.
Since I can't see you guys, would you like me to just quickly start and then, because I can't take cues about who's going first.
Please thanks, Golriz. If you could kind of pick up that second question, perhaps on the institutional fitness for purpose.
Yeah, so the way that I heard that is both, it's directed at existing governance institutions, both global and domestic. So is our Parliament fit for purpose to act quickly enough, and our other global institutions similarly fit for purpose given the urgency? I absolutely think we need those global multilateral institutions as well as our own democratic institutions to be part of this, but absolutely it is time to recognise that decision making can't be sustainable or fit for purpose if it's not actively participatory by the groups that are most impacted. And the climate crisis does impact different groups differently, even domestically. I think COVID sort of really should have taught us that lesson in terms of the solutions lying with different communities who are having different experiences of a shared crisis, but also that existing inequalities in our systems that have meant that those voices and the solutions that they need haven't been implemented or heard is going to weaken our sort of collective response. So unless the Pacific Island nations, and they are also different, you know, there's small atoll communities that have already had to move. So to the 2 other questions, and then there are bigger nation-state islands like Fiji who might be having a completely different experience again, and their relationships are really different with us and other global actors. So we do have to go, who are the communities most impacted, but also who are all the communities impacted, because they're having different experiences. And so, you know, whether it's domestically we involve iwi more, whether we recognise that our disabilities community, our lower income communities, women, gender minorities, that's the reality in even our domestic setting. So globally, that absolutely has to be implemented. Sorry, I can't hear. I mean, I would say also that issue of separating inequality in terms of sort of rising global poverty and the climate crisis is still really important. So I keep coming back to changing the way that we deal globally in terms of economic structures, the way we do trade, the way we see our allegiances in terms of everything else other than what we see as being the climate crisis is really important. We can't ghettoize the issue of climate crisis and separate it out from all the other ways that we govern and we make policy, because it sort of has, those things have implications. And as I sort of tried to touch on in my talk earlier, we've deprioritized Pacific voices and Pacific solutions on climate crisis because we've somehow seen things like trade and defence as being separate than that reset that we committed to. And I think if we if we recognise that we've committed to lifting the voices of the Pacific, we would know that it's the climate crisis that's their biggest issue, whether it's in terms of their economies, whether it's in terms of health, whether it's in terms of literal national security. So, yes, we need our democracy to act quickly, and we need our democracy to keep responding, and yes, we need to engage globally with those institutions, but that means resetting also our vantage point to prioritising those voices, because that's what democracy is meant to be, both globally and domestically.
Mm-hmm. So there were a couple of other questions, and one was about managed retreat. I wonder if Schannel, you might have some thoughts, or Peter, and then the panellists might also have some thoughts on New Zealand's responses to the issues of displacement in the Pacific.
Yeah, just quickly on that. If we look 20 years ago, the policy was very, very different. And we've iterated and we've changed, and there's been co-development. And that will continue to happen. That's how I see it. And the mere fact that we're having these conversations and there is more engagement means our policies and our strategies will get better. So it is a good question, but it is an iterative process. And so it should be, because you're never going to get it perfect on time, all the time. As far as managed retreat, which those two questions are quite related in what is up for grabs here. You know, when we start losing our land, we start losing our cultural identity. So it's not just relocation, it's a loss of identity, which is really hard to come to grapples with. And how do you solve for that when your land that you've known for thousands of years is no longer there? So these are some of the issues that are being thought on, and I don't have an answer to it, but I am very gladdened to see that people are talking about, very cognizant of it. What that managed retreat looks like is it looks different in every island because of the context, and some islands are opening up their extra land for their neighbours to come on. It doesn't take away the identity loss, but it really shows the strength of the region as a unit. This coastal retreat and what partners can do to help is, I guess, is something fundamental for this conference as well. How do partners really help engage? And I really like what the Prime Minister Mbuka had said earlier, is just like, we don't want aid. We want development in the terms of trainings and help build those capacities. I think that's where it also starts. But I'll hand off, because I talked.
Yeah, kia ora, and great questions. Obviously the students or the intellectuals in the room. Yeah, it's a big question. You're sort of talking about adaptation or mitigation. You hear these terms a lot in climate change, and when you talk about managed retreat, you're looking at sort of full-scale adaptation. That's kind of at the deep end. Potentially losing your island state, and looking at immigration issues, an example. I think I'd let the Member of Parliament answer that one. But I think if I look at some of our members, adaptation is getting conservation groups to get people to understand the coral reef system, the mangrove system, how that can support their foreshore, getting them to build resilient housing which will sustain a cyclone, and habitat for the humanity, which one of our members are doing that very much. That work is a lot of New Zealand engineering companies as well. So it's kind of a multifaceted approach.
Kia ora. Thank you. Look, I think we've got time for one more question, and I know that Eva has a question, and because her organisation is sponsoring the session, I think that kind of gives her priority. So we'll take your question, Eva, and as I do so, I just want to reiterate our thanks to Conrad Adenauer for its sponsorship for the session. And let's hear from you and then the panelists. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Vernon. It's actually a comment, not a question, so maybe we do have time for a question afterwards.
Okay.
I'll try and speak quickly. Someone raised a question of state responsibility, and I think it's fair to say that it depends. So I speak now not in my capacity as a representative of the foundation, but as a German lawyer and individual. But everyone would say we do have a moral obligation to help. But I think if you're asking about legal obligation, that there was actually, to the best of my memory, a case where a Pacific person applied for refuge or asylum to New Zealand, I think, and the court held there was no ground for it. That is because, of course, the convention doesn't provide for climate change as a ground for seeking and granting asylum or refuge. Sorry, that was my comment. Perhaps you can give someone else a chance to ask something else.
I would like to comment on that actually, because it was a subject of a question as well, and it's come out through some of our discussions. I do that as, you know, the first refugee MP, so-called. And just to hold those comments about, yes, absolutely, there'll be, this is a loss of identity issue. Displacement is a big deal, but it is very different than the Refugee Convention, both purpose and the way that it acts in life, which is that, I'm from Iran. Iranian culture and the nation state still exists. It's going to be very different, though, for those who can't return, not because of persecution, but because their homeland has gone underwater. So what the solution needs to entail is the preservation of that culture, the language. What I've heard from Pacific Island communities that I've spoken to is, where will we take our bones of our people? And that's the burial grounds, that's those traditions. So we can't expect people to go through a one per person refugee process where they apply for a visa as an individual and then get dispersed throughout the globe, because that won't be fit for purpose to preserve that cultural identity, the language, the burial sites. So we do absolutely have to rethink the solution, and I believe that it lies outside of the Refugee Convention. It's a new solution, and it has to be a collective solution that really takes account of what's happening for these communities. It won't be one person trying to prove climate change impacts them in particular, and it's their right to be protected from it. It will be entire communities who will need security, but also dignity for their culture to be preserved.
Thanks, Golriz. I'm really sorry, but we have run out of time, and I have questions, and I know that you have questions too. These topics run so deep that we could spend the rest of the day on it. But look, I want to thank you to the audience for your engagement. I'm sorry that we haven't been able to take all of the questions. My deep thanks to the panellists. Thank you for your time, for your input, for your constructive approach to these really challenging questions. I think that we are now moving to a short afternoon tea before we come to the next session. But will you join me and thank the panellists for their time this afternoon?